Welcome to section 7.3, where we're going to look at cells and kind of identify the various structures that we'll find inside of them. Now, many of these structures will be found in all types of cells, so that includes guys like this prokaryote that we have here on the left. The prokaryote is going to be the simpler version of cells, and so we will discuss some of these organelles that are found within them as well. But most of the organelles that we talk about are going to be the ones that we find in eukaryotes. So the cells that we commonly refer to as plant and animal cells, or sometimes they're just called complex cells. So keep in mind most of these organelles will fall into the type of organelle only found in one particular group of cells called the eukaryotes. These will be known for that because they have membranes that surround them. Any membrane-bound organelle, if you remember back to 7.1, will only be found in eukaryotic cells. So let's start with some of the most general things that we have. So when you look at the outside of a cell, all cells, every last one, is going to have a cell membrane. And that cell membrane is going to have our phospholipid bilayer, that's the fluid part, and it's going to have that mosaic, that mix of proteins, cholesterols, carbohydrates, all those other molecules that allow it to function as this semi-permeable barrier that helps make sure that what needs to get inside gets in, and what needs to get outside gets out, and what needs to stay outside stays out. So they play a vital role in determining kind of what gets in, what gets out, and to make sure the cell has what it needs to live. Now the cell wall is going to be something that's optional. So this one is not absolute. But what I will say that a lot of people get this wrong because they think a cell wall is only in plants. Basically anything except an animal cell can have a cell wall. So plant cells have them, fungal cells have them, bacterial cells have them in many cases, and it's just going to be that we've got this membrane, phospholipid bilayer, and then outside of that we're going to have some mesh oftentimes to provide either rigidity or protection of some other molecule. Now this could be chitin, this could be cellulose. If you want to talk about prokaryotes, you might see a really cool sounding molecule called peptidoglycan. You don't have to memorize that. But it can be a variety of different chemicals that make up this outer mesh that kind of just makes sure that the membrane has a layer of protection. You know, that the membrane's not the first thing that something encounters. Instead, it encounters a cell wall first. And so the cell wall will just be this layer that you see just exterior to the cell membrane. It's not on every cell, but there's quite a few cells that will have it. Now, as we talk about kind of the exterior parts of cells, we do have some other stuff that we tend to see that sticks out from cells. And there's two categories of these guys. There's flagella, which is going to be things that are much larger. That's what you see here. So these tend to be much more like tail-like. So these are bigger, they're normally fewer in number. So a lot of things have one flagella, you have some of them that have like two flagella. A few have more than that, but for the most part it's a relatively small number of these longer structures. And these structures normally either spin or move back and forth, and that allows them to propel the cell through a fluid. So this is what like sperm uses this as locomotion. And some things like sponges will actually use it where they'll beat the flagella, and instead of the cell moving, it makes water move along the cell. So it draws water through the sponge, which allows them to get fresh water moving in that has microorganisms that they feed upon. So you will see some like simple filter feeders use this, not because they're using it to move around themselves, but they're using it to move water around. And then the modified version of this, if you will, it's very similar, but it's not the exact same idea, is cilia. So with this, you tend to see lots and lots of hair-like extensions. These are not near as big as a flagella, but they're much more numerous. And so lots of organisms will also use this for movement, and that could be like paramecia, these little guys like you see here. They'll use it where they'll kind of beat them together, kind of like the rowing, and they can use it to propel themselves through the water. You'll also see that our trachea has these, so when we get mucus buildup in our lungs, we can actually use these cilia that kind of beat and draw the mucus up until eventually it dumps it in the back of your throat, where you can swallow it and destroy any bacteria that are caught in the mucus. That's why your back of your throat feels so funky when you're sick a lot of times. And so they can be used for movement such as that and to help things feed. So very similar overall in terms of their functionality. It's just instead of one or a few really large structures, you go with many, many small structures to accomplish a similar task. Now, when we talk about something being eukaryotic, one of the first things that you should really think about is nucleus, because that's really what eukaryotic means, true nucleus. Karyo is nucleus. And so when we first looked at cells, the nucleus happens to be one of the biggest organelles there is, so we can see it. And we noticed that some cells have it and some cells don't. And that's where we got this idea of prokaryote, before nucleus, that's what pro means, and eukaryote, true nucleus. Now, if something has a nucleus, the way this works is the nucleus is surrounded by something called a nuclear envelope. And it's really just a double phospholipid bilayer. So this is two phospholipid bilayers kind of together, and that allows for a lot of protection to make sure stuff can't get into your nucleus and mess with your DNA, because that's what's housed inside. And there are pores, so things ultimately can get into and out of the nucleus, but we're trying to make sure it's very controlled. And then inside of the nucleus, we've got the DNA, so this is going to be our genetic info, is what you can see, kind of all this pink stuff. And then we've got this more solid-looking structure. In this case, it looks like a dark gray, and that's called the nucleolus, or if it's plural, you might see nucleoli. And so sometimes you'll see this kind of dark globular shape inside the nucleus, and that's the structure that helps make ribosomes, which is why I put ribosomes on this slide with nucleus, because the nucleolus, one of its jobs is to help make them. And ribosomes is going to be a universal guy. This is something that all cells have. This is not going to be like the nucleus, which is specifically for eukaryotes. Everything's going to have ribosomes, because ribosomes are what are able to help you take the code from your DNA, your genetic code, and convert that into proteins. Their job is protein synthesis, to make proteins. And all cells are going to need these proteins to function. So all cells will have ribosomes. They have no membrane around them. They're just bits of protein and a specific type of RNA. So anybody can have them. They don't violate any rules about membrane-bound organelles. So ribosomes will be these small structures. You can see them here. They've got some of them sitting out by the nucleus. They've got some in the structure over here we'll learn is called the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER. And so these will be the ribosomes. And so these guys are kind of littered throughout your cytoplasm, that kind of fluid filling that's inside the cell. You're also going to see that they'll be attached to a lot of stuff, sometimes the nucleus, sometimes even the cell membrane, but very often this ER structure that we will talk about shortly. Now, some of the most cool organelles that we have are going to be the organelles that are responsible for providing energy to the cell. And there's two basic groups here. We've got the mitochondria, which is going to be the one that provides us with our energy. Specifically, it produces an energy molecule called ATP. ATP is the energy currency of our cells. It's like money. And so we'll make that money in the mitochondria and then use it elsewhere in the cell to provide energy for all the stuff that needs energy. So this is going to be a critical organelle that you see only in eukaryotes. It's got a membrane surround it. All the stuff that occurs in the mitochondria will occur essentially in the cytoplasm or in the actual plasma membrane, the cell membrane of a prokaryote. So it's not that prokaryotes can't do cell respiration. That's the process of making ATP, of breaking down food and storing the energy in this energy molecule. That can still be done by prokaryotes, but they have to go about it in a simpler way. So mitochondria, really cool structure, does cell respiration, provides us with ATP. We'll learn later too that this guy appears to have at one point been its own free-living prokaryote, so it's still got its own DNA, it's still got its own ribosomes, and the ribosomes look just like the ribosomes of a prokaryote. The ribosomes of a eukaryote are a little bit bigger, so you can tell the difference. You'll see it's got two phospholipid membranes. It's got an inner folded one that tends to be the easy way to identify a mitochondria, and then it's got the outer one where it looks like it was at one point kind of ingested, so a cell kind of ate another cell, but it didn't digest it, it just started working together. Where these mitochondrial cells, if you were at the time, so these cells that eventually became mitochondria do a really efficient job of making ATP, and so the parent cell, the host cell, kept it around and everybody was happy. Now, chloroplast will be our other main energy organelle that we're only going to find in guys that undergo photosynthesis, so that's going to be one criteria, and they also are going to have to be eukaryotes because this is going to be a membrane bound, so this is only going to be found in eukaryotes. I don't want to say just plant cells because there are algal cells, there are other protist cells that can do this process and that have chloroplasts. But we commonly will say a chloroplast is unique to plant cells, and we'll just kind of include all the other photosynthetic eukaryotes. Now, these guys will do photosynthesis, and so they're going to make these organic molecules. So typically they're going to make sugars, And these sugar molecules can then be converted to be fats, proteins, whatever else the organism needs. So the common way you might see people say this too is it makes food for the cell. And that food can then be broken down via mitochondria, via cell respiration, to ultimately provide ATP or energy for the cell. Now, I don't want to spend forever on what we call the cytoskeleton, but it is kind of important. It's a bit more complex than we'll get into, but I want you to realize that our cells are not just a bunch of liquid with a cell membrane around it and maybe a cell wall. They're going to have this whole network of protein fibers, these thin protein filaments that stretch across the cell. And as they push on the other sides of the cell, they determine the cell's shape. They provide this scaffolding for stuff to attach to. They ultimately provide avenues for things to crawl along to be transported from one part of the cell to another. And so it's critical that we have this cytoskeleton for a whole bunch of essential functions in the cell. Much like when they first build a skyscraper, you see all those metal beams that they put up first, and you get like that skeleton of the metal before they flesh it out with the rest. That's a lot like if you think about the proteins, they're put together a lot like those metal beams, those girders that support the actual skyscrapers that look like that skeletal framework. The other part that you'll see people talk about is the centrosome or centrioles. Now, every eukaryote is going to have centrosomes. Only animal cells are going to have centrioles. They're these little structures here you see that look like someone glued together some little strips of spaghetti. That's what the centriole is, and there should be a pair of them if you're an animal cell. Now, these guys are going to be responsible for making a particular type of protein fiber that's part of the cytoskeleton called a microtubule, because they're these little hollow tubes. And these guys will be vital later on when we start talking about cell division. These will be some of the guys that help organize and move chromosomes to allow cell division to occur.